Many people claim that Christmas was just copied from a pagan holiday that was on December 25th. But what are the facts? How did early Christians determine that Jesus was born on December 25th? And is that date correct? As I dug into this mystery, I found ancient documents, coins of Roman emperors, and clues from the Bible itself that reveal that almost all of the so-called facts that you hear about the origin of Christmas are completely wrong. In this video, I'm going to show you what the ancient records actually reveal about the day Christ was born and the origin of Christmas. But first, you need to understand that the calendar we use today has two different kinds of dates. AD is short for Anno Domini, which in Latin means the year of the Lord. BC is short for before Christ. 1 AD is supposed to be the first year of the Christian era, and 1 BC is supposed to be the year before Christ came. Most scholars believe that Jesus was actually born a few years before 1 AD, but what about the day? Where did the December 25th date come from, and when did Christians start celebrating it as the birthday of Christ? Most books say that Christmas was first mentioned in this ancient book called the Chronograph of 354. But that isn't quite true. This book was written in 354 AD, and it has a calendar with an event on December 25th, but it isn't Christmas. However, the date of Jesus' birth is mentioned in a list of Christian martyrs, which says, on the 8th day of the calends of January, Christ was born in Bethlehem of Judea. Calends is the Roman word for the first day of the month. That's where we get the word calendar from. So if you count 8 days backward, including January 1, you come to December 25th. This book also mentions the same date in a list of Roman consuls. Here it says, when these were consuls, Jesus Christ was born 8 days before the calends of January. Caesar and Paulus were consuls in 1 AD. So the person in Rome who finished making this book in the year 354 believed that Jesus was born on December 25th, 1 AD. But this is where history starts to get messy, because people seeking to defend Christmas usually interpret this book as proof that Christmas was celebrated in the year 354. But people who want to prove that Christmas is pagan also find clues in this book to support their theory. The truth is, most of the information you hear about Christmas is from people who are just repeating something they heard on social media, which was repeating something else written in an article, which was based on information from an encyclopedia, which came from information in books, and perhaps the authors of those books actually looked at the original documents. At every step of this game of telephone, people's biases slip in, information changes, and the truth gets lost. So today I'm going to show you the original documents about Christmas, so you can make your own conclusions about when and how it began. And instead of just looking for proof to support our current beliefs, I invite you to join me on a quest for truth. This document doesn't actually say anything about Christians celebrating Christmas. It just mentions the date Jesus was born. The December 25th date on the calendar actually lists a different celebration, which we'll look at in a moment. But first, let's search for the earliest proof of an actual Christmas celebration. Let's start with this claim from Facebook, which says, in 354, Bishop or Pope Liberius of Rome ordered the people to celebrate on December 25. As you might guess, the year 354 comes from the ancient book we just looked at, which doesn't say anything about Bishop Liberius. We also don't have any record of an order from this bishop to celebrate December 25th. What we do have is a book written around 377 AD by Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. In this book, he mentions what Liberius, the Bishop of Rome, said to his sister when she took a vow to be a nun on the birthday of Jesus. Here's the quote. You, he said, my daughter, have desired a good espousal. You see how great a crowd has come together for the birthday of your spouse, and none has gone away without food. There isn't any order here to celebrate Christmas, but it does look like there was some kind of early Christmas celebration on this day, because it says the crowd came together for the birthday of Christ. Liberius was Bishop of Rome between May 352 and September 366. So here we have the first solid evidence of a celebration of the birth of Jesus in Rome, and surprisingly, this was more than 350 years after Jesus was born. But what about other places beyond Rome? The next evidence we have of a December 25th celebration comes from Constantinople, the capital of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. In 380 AD, Gregory of Nazianzus was appointed as Bishop of Constantinople, and he gave a sermon on Christmas Day. He said, The present festival is the Theophany or birthday. It is this which we are celebrating today, the coming of God to man. 6 years later in Antioch, John Chrysostom mentioned how fast this new festival was spreading. Although it is not yet the 10th year since this day became clear and familiar to us, through your zeal it has now flourished. This day was known from the beginning to those in the West. Now it has been brought to us, and before the passing of many years has swiftly shot up, bearing such fruit as you now see, the precincts full and the church packed with the crowd who have gathered together. I well know that many are still debating with each other about it, some arguing against, some for. Everywhere there is a lot of conversation about this day, some saying accusingly that the day is a new innovation which has only recently been introduced, while others contend that it is ancient and venerable. Part of the debate at this time was not only whether the feast was new or not, but which day Jesus was actually born. Some argued that Jesus was actually born on January 6th. In fact, about this time in the early 380s, a female pilgrim named Agaria described a celebration at Jerusalem and Bethlehem called Epiphany, celebrating the nativity of Jesus. Epiphany is celebrated on January 6th, so some people in the East had already begun to celebrate the birth of Jesus, but they were celebrating it on January 6th instead of December 25th. The preachers who brought the December 25th date to the East worked hard to show that these two competing dates were actually celebrating two different events. Gregory of Nazianzus explained in his sermon on January 6, 381, that the Feast of Epiphany, the holy day of lights to which we have come and to which we are celebrating today, has for its origin the baptism of my Christ. And later in this sermon he mentions that, at his birth, several days before, we duly kept festival. From this time forward, we suddenly find a lot of evidence of Christ's birth being celebrated, in some places on December 25th, and in other places on January 6th. We know the December 25th celebration reached Alexandria by 432 AD because Paulus, bishop of Emesa, preached a Christmas sermon on that day. Eventually, the December 25th date prevailed almost everywhere. But where did this date come from? Did Christians really copy the date from a pagan festival, as some claim? The most popular explanation of the origin of the December 25th date is a claim that Romans worshipped the sun god on that day, and Christians just adopted the day and changed it into a celebration of the birth of Christ. Here's what Wikipedia currently says. According to some scholars, the Emperor Aurelian instituted in AD 274 the festival Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, birthday of the invincible sun, on 25 December. This is what I believed before I dug deeper to do the research for this video. But when I checked all of the original sources about Aurelian, I found that although they say he built a temple to the sun god, none of them say anything about December 25th. So where did that date come from? Remember that old book, The Chronograph of 354? This is what it has on the calendar for December 25th. Natalis Invicti, 30 chariot races. The word Natalis here can mean birthday, but on a calendar it usually means anniversary. Invictus means the unconquered, and it was a title for many different Roman gods. So the first assumption scholars have made is that Invictus here means the sun god, Sol Invictus. The second assumption is that Aurelian instituted this festival in the year 274. Without proof, these are just guesses, so let's dig deeper. A few years after this calendar was made, in 361 AD, Julian the Apostate composed a hymn to King Helios. Helios is the Greek name for the sun god. The two emperors before Julian had begun to Christianize the Roman Empire, but as soon as Julian came to power, he began to promote the old Roman religion again. This is what he wrote about the end of the year. Before the beginning of the year, at the end of the month which is called after Kronos, we celebrate in honor of Helios the most splendid games, and we dedicate the festival to the invincible sun. This seems to refer to the same festival that we saw in the calendar from the year 354, and Julian specifically links this festival to the sun god. This connection is also supported by an anonymous document, probably written around this time, which says Jesus was born on December 25th, and that they also call it birthday of the Invictus. But who is Invictus, or unconquered, if not our Lord, who suffered death and then conquered it? Or when they call it birthday of the sun, well, Christ is the Son of Righteousness that the prophet Malachi spoke of. The Son of Righteousness shall arise for all you who fear his name. Salvation is in his wings. So these additional documents confirm that December 25th was indeed considered the birthday of the unconquered Son. Julian didn't come to power until 7 years after the calendar we saw was made, so these celebrations couldn't have been invented by Julian. They also wouldn't have been created by the two earlier emperors, who worked to suppress pagan practices since at least 325 AD. So even if this anniversary wasn't made by Aurelian in 274 AD, it does look like it was established sometime before Christians began celebrating Christmas in the middle of the 4th century. But in a moment, I'm going to show you evidence that some Christians already believed December 25th was the day of Christ's birth. But first, let's look more carefully at this anonymous document that is probably from the late 4th century. This document is On the Solstices and the Equinoxes, and it connects a number of events surrounding the life of Jesus to the beginning of the 4 seasons. We find these events in the Gospel of Luke, which begins the story of the life of Jesus with an account about a priest named Zechariah who was serving in the Jewish temple when an angel told him that his wife would give birth to a prophet named John. About 6 months later, an angel also appeared to Mary and told her that she would give birth to Jesus. The author of the document we are looking at now believed there was a divine pattern in all of these dates, and he connected them to the solstices and equinoxes like this. He placed the conception of John on the autumn equinox when day and night are both 12 hours long. Then he placed the conception of Jesus 6 months later on the spring equinox. He also put the birth of John at the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the year, and he put the birth of Jesus at the winter solstice, which is the shortest day of the year, and also happens to be December 25th. The dates shown here are not the actual days of the solstices and equinoxes, because by the time Jesus was born, all of these dates were about 2 days behind the solar events. And by the time the document we're looking at was written, they were about 5 days behind. But even so, at that time, most people believed these days were correct, regardless of the facts. What is very interesting is that these are the same dates that are still celebrated today for these events. So near the end of the 4th century, these events mentioned in the Bible were connected to the cycle of the sun and the Roman calendar in this neat, symmetrical pattern. But we are still left with the question on where these dates came from. The Bible itself doesn't mention any date, but it does have a few clues about the time of year, which we will look at later. The earliest Christian writers also didn't mention anything about the date. But in the year 190 AD, we come to an interesting document describing a council in Caesarea. This is how it began. When all the apostles had gone from this life, fasts were differently observed throughout the world. For all the Gauls kept the Pascha, meaning Easter here, on one day, March 25th, saying, "Why should we keep the Pascha with the Jews according to the moon? But as the birth of the Lord on whatever day it falls is kept on December 25th, so we ought to keep the Pascha on March 25th, when Christ is said to have risen." This is the earliest reference to a date for Christ's birth, and it says it was kept on December 25th. But there is a problem with this document. Notice that if you continue reading, it mentions the history of Eusebius, which wasn't written until 135 years after this document was supposedly written. And it would certainly be strange if Christmas was actually being kept this early, that we wouldn't find any other hints of its observance until more than 160 years later. In fact, this is just one of many documents that appeared in the British Isles around 600 AD, and these documents contain numerous clues that they aren't authentic. At that time, there was a debate in the British Isles over how to calculate the date of Easter, and some of those involved in the debate resorted to forging fake historical documents to defend their views. The first genuine mention of a date for Christ's birth comes from 198 AD. This is what Clement of Alexandria wrote at that time. "There are those who have determined not only the year of our Lord's birth, but also the day, and they say that it took place in the 28th year of Augustus, and in the 25th day of the Egyptian month, Pachon, which is May 20th. Further, others say that he was born on the 24th or 25th day of Pharmuthi, which is April 20 or 21. These early guesses for Christ's date of birth weren't anywhere close to December 25th. And the reason Clement mentioned these dates was that he was trying to show that Jesus fulfilled the 70 weeks prophecy. This prophecy from the book of Daniel foretold of a coming Messiah who would appear a certain number of years after a command was given to rebuild Jerusalem. This prophecy was of great interest to Christians who tried to connect Christ's birth and death into a timeline of history. 2 years later, in 200 AD, Tertullian from Carthage also connected Daniel's prophecy to the birth of Christ, but he didn't mention the day Jesus was born. However, Tertullian is the first to mention that Christ died on March 25th, which, as we have seen, people believed was the date of the spring equinox. A few years later, Hippolytus, Bishop of Rome, wrote this in a commentary on the book of Daniel. For the first advent of our Lord in the flesh, when he was born in Bethlehem, was December 25th, a Wednesday, while Augustus was in his 42nd year, but from Adam 5,500 years. He suffered in the 33rd year, March 25th, Friday, the 18th year of Tiberius Caesar, while Rufus and Rubellion were consuls. Here we finally have the first mention of December 25th, but most scholars believe that this date was added to this document at a later time. But I checked into this and I think they're wrong. We have 6 Greek manuscripts with this passage, which are copies made between the 10th and 14th centuries. 5 of these contain the date of December 25th, but that date and some other information is missing from one manuscript from the 11th century, and the oldest manuscript also has an incomplete date in March or April in addition to the date of December 25th. Most scholars think that the original date was actually April 2nd, but the only textual evidence for this is an incomplete date in one manuscript that's right alongside the December 25th date. The manuscript evidence actually gives almost universal support to the date of December 25th, so the simplest explanation is that one copyist left that part out, as he did with several other parts, and that the oldest manuscript, which was copied more than 700 years after the original, contains an error. But in a moment I'll show you why most scholars think the April 2nd date is correct. But first, notice that this commentary has a clue about where Hippolytus got his dates from. He places the arrival of Jesus 5,500 years after the first man Adam. He probably first determined this number by counting up the ages of people listed in the Greek translation of the Bible, along with events in history, which add up to approximately 5,500 years. If you do the same thing with the original Hebrew version of the Bible, you only get about 4,000 years between Adam and Jesus. The reason for the difference is that some of the numbers were changed when the Bible was translated into Greek, but most Christian writers at this time thought the numbers in the Greek Bible were correct. To prove that the 5,500 years was correct, Hippolytus appealed to symbolism, and this is a key to understanding the dates he proposed. His proof came from the measurements of the Ark of the Covenant, a wooden box covered with gold that served as the throne of God in the temple. If we take the length, width, and height of this box, it adds up to 5.5 cubits. Hippolytus believed that this ark represented Jesus, and the measurements foretold that Christ would come 5,500 years after creation. Following the same line of thought, Hippolytus said that after Jesus came, another 500 years would remain until Jesus returned to defeat the Romans and rule on earth for 1,000 years, as pictured by the Sabbath. We'll come back to this later, but first let's finish our search for the real origin of the December 25th date. If Hippolytus thought Jesus came exactly 5,500 years after Adam, did he calculate the day of Christ's birth from the day of creation? To test this theory, let's look at this marble statue in Rome made in 222 AD. Many people believe this is a statue of Hippolytus because on the back it lists many of the books Hippolytus wrote. Here on the side it has a chart that can be used to calculate the date of Passover in any year. Notice that right here, next to April 2, it says Genesis of Christ. The Greek word Genesis means beginning, and it can refer to either the conception or birth of a person. So April 2nd could be Hippolytus' date for the birth of Christ. But if he meant conception, then December 25th is about 9 months later. So which date is correct? We find another clue in Hippolytus' chronology of the world, which he completed in the year 235 AD. In this chronology, Hippolytus places the Genesis of Christ 5,502 years and 9 months after creation. Since Hippolytus added an extra 9 months here, I think he believed Jesus was conceived 5,502 years after creation and then born 9 months later. There's also good reason to think that he believed the world was created near Passover because in his chronology of the world he counts many periods of time from Passover to Passover. So Hippolytus probably believed that Jesus was born on December 25th. Another document written a few years later seems to build on the ideas of Hippolytus. It's an anonymous text in Latin called De Pascha Computus. Pascha can mean either the Jewish Passover or Easter, depending on the context, and this document deals with the calculation of Passover and Easter. This document claims that when God created the first day, day and night were equally divided, which he interprets to mean that creation began on March 25th, the presumed date of the spring equinox. He then goes on to calculate that the sun and moon were created 4 days later on March 28th. And then he says, "How excellent and divine providence of the Lord that on the day in which the sun was made, on that very day Christ was born, March 28." Even though these authors give different dates for Christ's birth, there is a common idea that Christ's conception and birth fit into some kind of perfect pattern designed by God from the beginning of the world. In these early Christian documents, we have already found at least 4 different dates that some people believed Jesus was born. So if some people thought they knew the exact day Jesus was born, why don't we find any evidence of people celebrating his birth until much later? We find the answer in a sermon by Origen of Alexandria on the book of Leviticus, where he said, "Not one from all the saints is found to have celebrated a festive day or a great feast on the day of his birth. No one is found to have had joy on the day of his birth or of his son or daughter. Only sinners rejoice over this kind of birthday, for indeed we find in the Old Testament Pharaoh, king of Egypt, celebrating the day of his birth with a festival, and in the New Testament, Herod." This is evidence that Christians in the year 244 AD viewed birthday celebrations as a pagan custom. This was actually a long-held belief because 150 years earlier, the Jewish historian Josephus also wrote, "The law does not permit us to make festivals at the birth of our children." This explains why we don't find any early evidence of people celebrating Christ's birth. Jews and early Christians didn't celebrate birthdays. But then something changed. In 312 AD, Constantine, the emperor of the Romans, suddenly began to give his support to Christians. 12 years later, he removed images of the sun god's soul from his coins and began placing the first 2 letters of Christ on his coins instead. The next year, in 325 AD, Constantine gathered bishops from around the empire to settle their disagreements, and he actively promoted Christianity in the Roman Empire. As Constantine, and later his son, promoted Christianity and discouraged pagan worship, many millions of Romans became Christians, including Valentinus, the person who commissioned the chronograph of 354, which we looked at the beginning. This book is actually a strange collection of Roman art, history, and even astrology, which is forbidden in the Bible, along with lists of Christian martyrs, bishops, and dates for Easter. This book is an example of how much Christianity evolved during this time period as it swelled with new converts everywhere in the Roman Empire. The original belief that Jesus Christ would return and conquer the Romans was quickly replaced with a new vision that Christ would use the Roman Empire to Christianize the world. And birthday celebrations, which were a normal part of Roman life, soon became a normal part of Christianity. And so it was only natural that Christians at this time would begin to celebrate the birth of their King, Jesus. Later, incorporating local traditions into Christian celebrations actually became a tactic to complete the Christianization of the Roman Empire. This is what Pope Gregory the Great wrote to a missionary going to England around 601 AD. "Tell Augustine that he should by no means destroy the temples of the gods, but rather the idols within those temples. Let him, after he has purified them with holy water, place altars and relics of the saints in them, for if those temples are well built, they should be converted from the worship of demons to the service of the true God. Thus, seeing that their places of worship are not destroyed, the people will banish error from their hearts and come to the places familiar and dear to them in acknowledgement and worship of the true God. Further, since it has been their custom to slaughter oxen in sacrifice, let them therefore celebrate the occasion with religious feasting. They will sacrifice and eat the animals not any more as an offering to the devil, but for the glory of God, to whom, as the giver of all things, they will give thanks for having been satiated." So over time, the customs of many nations would be incorporated into the celebration of Christmas and other holidays. Considering this history of Christmas, some wonder, is it okay for Christians to celebrate Christmas? But a better question is, what does God want us to do? And where can we find an answer if not in the Bible? Here are two scriptures to consider. Take heed to yourself that you are not ensnared to follow other nations, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, "How did these nations serve their gods? I also will do likewise." You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. Whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it, nor take away from it. The second is a prophecy of the future, when Jesus will return as king. And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. If Jesus is going to make everyone keep the Feast of Tabernacles and other biblical feasts in the future, why did Christianity stop celebrating those holidays and replace them with new celebrations? That's a topic for another video. But before we end, let's see what the Bible itself says about when Jesus was born. The Gospel of Luke says that before Mary gave birth to Jesus, there was a Roman census. So Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So it was, while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Some Bible scholars point out that it was unlikely that the Romans would have done this registration in December, when the weather is unfavorable. The story also continues with another clue about the time Jesus was born. Now there were, in the same country, shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Since sheep and shepherds were outside at night, this probably wasn't the coldest part of the year, which lasts from December to February. So Jesus almost certainly wasn't born in December. And since God hasn't revealed the date to us, I suppose it's not really something we need to worry about.